The Prime Minister and Minister of Finance presents his mid-year budget communication, the opposition response to the budget report, and a fatal police-involved shooting here in the capital. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jcn with your Jcn News for this Wednesday, February 24th. Thanks for staying with us. During the first 6 months of the 2020-2021 fiscal year, total revenue contracted by an estimated $415.3 million to $673.4 million compared to how the figures stacked up during the same period last year. This much coming from Prime Minister Dr. Hubert Minnis this morning. With the details, here's our Leah Cooper.
While delivering the mid-year budget statement in the House of Assembly, Prime Minister and Minister of Finance Dr. Hubert Minnis says the contraction amounted to 38.1% of the full-year budget estimate. He adds that when we take a closer look at the components of this revenue, we understand that the collection of taxes contracted by $425 million to $568.5 million. Dr. Minnis says this is largely driven by reductions in VAT collections of $228.9 million to $286.4 million, lower intake from international trade taxes by $128.7 million to $103.2 million, and excise tax reductions of $43.6 million to $88.9 million.
Reductions are largely a result of the reimposition of certain COVID-19 health and safety measures as the country experienced its second wave, resulting in a slower than anticipated economic recovery and consequently lower tax receipts.
Dr. Minnis adds that the extension of the government's Special Economic Recovery Zone program to December 31st, allowing those in Grand Bahama and Abaco to continue to rebuild in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian, also, as anticipated, had the effect of reducing government tax revenue. He also notes that non-tax revenue, however, improved by $9.9 million to $103.9 million, supported by an increase in rent revenue of $11.9 million, attributed to the timing of the AUTEC lease payment. Premiums, fees, and claims also improved by $17.7 million, owning a $18 million premium on the government's December U.S. dollar bond offering.
Mr. Speaker, due to the very trying economic times faced during the first half of the year, the government has sought, where possible, to limit the growth in overall expenditure. The year-over-year growth in expenditure of $112.1 million at the midpoint of the fiscal year has been fueled by the massive increases in funding to support social programs. This has driven expenditure up to $1.41 billion. As the economy rebounds and tourism activities resume, we anticipate a significant moderation in expenditure as persons go back to work and the government begins to wind down of its current outlays on social support programs.
He adds that in terms of recurrent expenditure, outlays grew by $119.5 million to $1.3 billion, which equated to 50.4% of the budget.
Key components of current spending include the following, Mr. Speaker. 1. Compensation of employees, which comprises wages, salaries, allowances, and NIB contributions, declined to $342.3 million as the previous mid-year tally included the public lump sum payment done in December 2019. The government continued its commitment to reduce the $360 million in arrears it inherited in 2017, and as of December 2020, approximately $282.7 million in arrears have been settled since the start of the program.
Subsidies and transfers to non-financial public corporations increased to $205.7 million to support operational costs, in particular salaries due to COVID-19 economic hardship, and to support health and safety measures. These transfers, Dr. Minnis says, include $117.1 million to the Public Hospitals Authority, $34.8 million to Bahamas Air, $19 million to National Health Insurance, and $15.2 million to the Water and Sewage Corporation. He adds that transfers to private non-financial corporations increased by $2.7 million to $12.7 million and includes an increase of $5 million to independent schools who would have faced economic hardships due to the COVID-19 pandemic's economic downturn. Social assistance benefits also increased by $91.6 million to $104.4 million compared to the same period in the previous year, largely due to increased demand on the government's social support programs such as the Unemployment Assistance Program managed by NIB, the specially created National Food Distribution Task Force, and the Department of Social Services Ordinary Food Assistance Program. The Prime Minister says the government understood the crisis and the severe effect on the country's revenue, but it recognized that the priority is always to do what is necessary. I'm Leah Cooper.
Well, the PM's mid-year budget communication demonstrates that the country is suffering from three crises: the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the governance of the Minnis administration. Those are the words of Progressive Liberal Party Deputy Leader and Shadow Minister of Finance, who also contends that the Minister of Finance's mid-year report is poorly crafted. For the opposition's take on the communication in the House of Assembly, we go to our Tyler Simonet.
Yet another poorly crafted fantasy is what Opposition Deputy Leader and Shadow Finance Minister Chester Cooper is calling the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance's mid-year budget report. During a press conference in the minority of the House of Assembly following the PM's mid-year budget communication, Mr. Cooper told reporters that the latest midterm budget communication demonstrates that the country is suffering from three crises.
At a time when leadership should inspire confidence, this administration engenders none. The fiscal strategy report is also devoid of any meaningful strategy, just a repeat of the same old rhetoric. Meanwhile, many have undue or overdue payments from NIB. Many have overdue payments from NIB. Many remain jobless, hungry, and suffering, with minimal compassionate relief. One almost never hears this administration speak of the real pain and suffering so many of our fellow Bahamians are currently enduring. These are the people who this mid-year budget should prioritize, but it has not.
The opposition is expressing great concern about the double-edged sword of increased borrowing and dwindling revenues as certain sectors of the economy remain closed.
The revenue position is much weaker than expected, with a $425 million fall-off against previous period. This puts us at the position of only having collected around 40% of projected revenue to the midpoint. Without any significant improvement, this will likely translate to a revenue shortfall well in excess of $400 million for the full fiscal year. At this rate, we are headed for another record fiscal deficit that could near $2 billion without a plan to increase revenue prospects.
Mr. Cooper contends that the communication was devoid of any real strategy and was a rehash of what the public already knew and what was presented in the 6-month fiscal snapshot.
We also have a Minister of Finance who has failed to follow the law on reporting on procurements during the emergency orders or timely debate and reporting as mandated by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. First, they blamed the PLP for them raising the rate of VAT to a disastrous result. Then they blamed Dorian for knocking off their always ill-advised Fiscal Responsibility Act targets. Now we are told that COVID is to blame for everything. We hear a great deal of blame. Today we saw a great deal of deflection, yet we never hear a credible plan.
The Shadow Finance Minister says Bahamians should brace themselves for an unprecedented period of economic calamity and stagnation under the Minnis-led administration. For Jcn News, I'm Tyler Simonet.
Let me!
That's the emotional cries of family members and friends of the victim of another fatal police-involved shooting, which unfolded here in the capital last night. Assistant Commissioner of Police Solomon Cash was at the scene, detailing to reporters that shortly before 10 p.m., police were on patrol on East Street and Cordo Avenue when they observed a vehicle that came through one of the police checkpoints on Wolf Road and East Street.
The officers engaged that vehicle. Subsequently, the vehicle continued traveling south along East Street and Highway to speed. The officers engaged their beacon lights. They signaled to the vehicle to stop. Eventually, the vehicle came to a stop here at this location. When the officers approached the vehicle, the driver came from the vehicle holding a weapon in his hand. The officers at the time produced their service pistols and they engaged that suspect, fatally wounding him. As a result, the Her Majesty's acting coroner was summoned to the scene and was briefed as to the circumstances surrounding this incident.
Asked if the victim shot at the police, ACP Cash says he was unsure at the time as they were still in the early stages of investigation. According to ACP Cash, the victim appeared to be in his early 30s and was shot multiple times in the chest area. There was reportedly a large crowd of people wishing to speak to the police about the incident. 3 police officers were involved in this incident. However, none of the officers were injured. ACP Cash told reporters that one of the officers was wearing a body cam and that footage will be made public. ACP Cash also revealed that the victim was known to police. This is the second fatal police-involved shooting for the year. You're watching JCN News. When we return, the PLP responds to the former Minister of Youth, Sports and Culture's resignation, and the new minister shares his plans. Stay with us.